Hello, guys. Unfortunately, time being what it is, we're going to have to rely on reading and this screencast to cover Andrew Jackson this week. We talked about Andrew Jackson a little bit, and you have your document based question on Andrew Jackson to complete. But I wanted to provide a little bit of extra support here. So I'm going to do a brief lecture on Andrew Jackson here. I could say quite a bit about him, but I'm going to try to keep it right to the facts. When we talk about Andrew Jackson, we will often hear this phrase common man. And it's interesting to note that Andrew Jackson could be viewed as a common man, an average guy born in a log cabin, uh, old hickory, a war hero, a man's man, all of those fights and duels. But he's also oftentimes seen as a common tyrant, someone who is exceedingly democratic in his ideals, but in many ways achieves his democratic goals in ways that many people would say are very undemocratic. So, with that in mind, as I go through Jackson, one thing to think about as we go through all of his actions as president was that Jackson is a common man who, in many ways, goes about achieving his political goals in a way that a common man certainly wouldn't. So let's begin a little bit here. I love this quote. Thomas Jefferson on Andrew Jackson, he once said, "He could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly and has often choked with rage. He is a dangerous man." I love that quote because in many ways I find it sad because Jackson loved Jefferson. He was committed to Jeffersonian ideals. And in many ways, Jackson is more of a Jeffersonian than Jefferson is. And if I were to go back to that quote, Jackson doesn't have any of the thoughtfulness that a Jefferson has. So, for example, Jefferson may have been opposed to the national bank on the grounds of the constitutionality, his view of the strict construction of the government, but when he becomes president, he doesn't get rid of the national bank because he saw that it was effective, that it was working, and he didn't want to put the economy in danger. Whereas this phrase, I can't say it better than Jefferson, he has a rashness of feelings. Jackson believed that he was right in almost everything that he does and is incredibly unapologetic about his actions, the bank being just one example of that. So one way to view Jackson is almost through the lens of Jefferson. And when we talk about synthesis and comparing different time periods or people, Jackson and Jefferson make for a very interesting comparison and contradiction. So let's talk about Jackson as the common man. I love the start of Jackson's presidency. He's a common man. He opens up the White House to the people. He has this big giant chunk of cheese brought in. And of course, the average person, when they're in the White House, these average people from the West who are so excited to see their champion win the presidency after the failed attempt in 1824, where Jackson, and many people feel, was cheated out of the presidency when Henry Clay threw his support to John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams made Henry Clay the Secretary of State, something that's sometimes referred to as the corrupt bargain. After that, 4 years later, Jackson becomes president and invites the people into the home and this big giant chunk of cheese, and the whiskey is flowing and more people are coming and more whiskey is flowing, and before you know it, fists are flying and there's fighting and there's blood. Jackson has to sneak out of the window. Later, critics will call this the inaugural brawl. I'm not sure if I have that there. No, of course, this is an inaugural ball, but it's lampooned as the inaugural brawl. And I always like to say, so Jackson's presidency begins with, the smell of blood, alcohol, and cheese. How appropriate. Jackson benefits from this changing policy of universal manhood suffrage. It's important to note that he doesn't put forth this policy, but he's going to benefit from it. So when the average person can vote, the average person is going to find Jackson to be a very appealing character, and personality becomes much more important in terms of politics with Jackson. Jackson and the Peggy Eaton incident, sometimes called the Petticoat Affair. This is a very long and very interesting story. I'm going to try to cut it short without stealing all of the spiciness of it. But Peggy O'Neill was her name. She was a very vivacious, pretty woman who was known about Washington, and she got married to this guy. I apologize, I don't remember his first name, but his last name was Timberlake, so she became Peggy Timberlake for a while, and the Timberlakes had fallen on some hard times, and the guy was out of work, and a good friend of theirs, John Eaton, who was in Jackson's cabinet, helped him get a job and procured him a job in the Navy. The only thing is that he had to, of course, go on a ship and leave town. And while he was on the boat, many people believe, it's never been 100% corroborated, but many people believe that Peggy and John Eaton started to have an affair. Well, news got back to Timberlake, and Timberlake killed himself, committed suicide. Now, can you imagine the scandal? Shortly thereafter, Peggy married John Eaton, and Eaton was a member of Jackson's cabinet. The scandal, it's one of the most scandalous incidences in American history. This cabinet member gets this guy a job, ends up having an affair with his wife, he commits suicide, then she ends up marrying John Eaton. This is incredibly scandalous. We talked briefly in class about Jackson's own personal scandals and how his wife was dragged through the mud and accused of being a polygamist, and how that affected Andrew Jackson's view of her death, and how he always felt like these political scandals helped cause her death. So Jackson, this is such a common man, right? Jackson defends Peggy Eaton. And when other members of the cabinet start to blackball her from events or are very, very cold to her in social settings, Jackson gets involved. The most notable of her detractors was John C. Calhoun's wife. And I always like to share John C. Calhoun's wife's name is Fluoride Calhoun. I think if that wasn't her real name, you'd have to make that up. Fluoride Calhoun. That speaks to the antiseptic nature, that she had about Peggy Eaton, and Peggy Eaton in her eyes was trash. Well, Andrew Jackson will eventually fire his entire cabinet over Peggy Eaton, and that's an unprecedented event in American history for any reason, let alone the scandals of this woman. So it illustrated a very common man approach. This is an average man type thing to do, come to the defense of a common woman, a woman who's being treated badly by people who see themselves as well above her, the aristocrats, the Fluoride Calhouns. Andrew Jackson also, most famously, this is one of the things that people often know about Andrew Jackson, is that he gave jobs to friends and supporters. We call that the spoils system. To the victor goes the spoils. Now, this sounds very corrupt to us, and we might think it is corrupt, but Andrew Jackson, in typical Jacksonian way, did not believe he was ever wrong, and thought that if you won, that clearly there was a mandate from the people for your ideas, and hence your supporters, the people who support your ideas, should be in power. And if you don't like it, well, the next election you can vote for someone else, and then they'll put their person in power. Andrew Jackson believed that the spoils system, he didn't deny it, but he didn't believe it was corrupt. As a matter of fact, he believed that it was democratic. And I know that line right there might help particularly with your DBQ, in that they asked that. Others view Jackson as a common tyrant. Jackson supports his ideas, his democratic ideas, in an exceedingly undemocratic way. For example, the veto of the bank. Now, we're very accustomed to presidents vetoing legislation today, but in many ways, Jackson's the one that establishes this idea. Jackson vetoes more laws than all of the previous presidents that come before him combined. And the difference is other presidents would only veto laws that they believed were unconstitutional. Jackson vetoed laws that he just didn't like. And sometimes he vetoed laws of people that he didn't like. Most famously, his political enemy, Henry Clay, had a bill passed for the creation of a road in Henry Clay's state, a road called the Maysville Road. Jackson vetoed it. And everyone believed that this was a personal attack on Henry Clay. Of course, Jackson denied it. Jackson said that he didn't believe that federal funds should be used to build a state road. But it just illustrates this view of Jackson as a common tyrant. Earlier, I told you the Peggy Eaton story. He fires his entire cabinet over this one incident. And of course, that could be viewed as a tyrannical measure. Jackson, as Thomas Jefferson stated in the beginning of this screencast, Jackson took things personally. And it was personal to him. His final word, not his final words, but almost his final words. When he was old, he was once asked, "Hey, Old Hickory, you have any regrets?" He said, "I have only 2 regrets. I never shot Henry Clay, and I never hung John C. Calhoun." That is something. Most people regret that, they didn't stop to smell the roses. Andrew Jackson regrets not killing 2 of his political enemies. I think it speaks volumes. Of course, probably the single most famous incident of Jackson's presidency is the forced removal of the Cherokee Indians. In typical Jackson fashion, Jackson said that what he did for the Native Americans, or to the Native Americans, was to help them, was to save them. And interestingly enough, Jackson actually had an adopted Native American child, and he professed great love for the Native Americans. Now, we can debate whether or not he was sincere or whether or not we believe him, but Jackson, that's what Jackson said. He said that if the Native Americans stayed, they would have faced violence and persecution, and his idea was to remove them to protect them. Of course, it leads to the Trail of Tears, which is one of the darkest moments in Native American history. Alex de Tocqueville, who we talked about in class, had this to say: "General Jackson is the majority's slave. He yields to its intentions, desires, and half-revealed instincts, or rather he anticipates and forestalls them." So this idea of Jacksonian democracy, was Jacksonian democracy really democratic? Another question that is addressed in the DBQ. Or was Jacksonian democracy an example of a tyrannical president who abused his power in many ways? Now, what I didn't have time to talk about in this brief presentation are things like the tariff debate and how Andrew Jackson dealt with that. I want to encourage you strongly, of course, to read Chapter 10 to get some of that information. But I'm going to end this screencast with one of my favorite stories. It's from Jackson's funeral. At Jackson's funeral, a man went up to Jackson's longtime friend, Martin Van Buren, and he whispered into Van Buren's ear. He said, "So, do you think Old Hickory's in heaven?" So they're at the funeral. He says, "You think Old Hickory's in heaven?" Martin Van Buren whispers back, "If Jackson wants to go to heaven, he'll go to heaven." I love that story. It illustrates Jackson. Jackson did what he wanted to do, regardless of the Supreme Court, regardless of Congress, regardless of politics. Jackson did what he believed was right. So normally I would lecture extensively on Andrew Jackson. There's so many great stories. There's so much to say. But for the purposes of your DBQ, that should really help you quite a bit with the DBQ. Needless to say, you got to do the reading. And I wish you a very nice break. We have Thanksgiving coming up, and I hope you enjoy it.